with all due respect.
Hey, we're Josh Ortegan and Gray Gaines, and this is With All Due Respect, the show where we keep it real about health, fitness, and performance. From weight loss to sports development, we're covering the conversations that matter.
Follow us on Instagram at Phnm Fitness, PHNM Fitness, and visit www.phenomfit.com to check out our training programs, coaching, and gear built for real results. Let's get into it.
Hey guys, Josh Ortegan, With All Due Respect is the name of our podcast. And this episode of bringing on Don Reagan, who is a professor of motor learning and motor development. And this is about skill acquisition. If you're involved in jiu-jitsu, you've been having the conversations, or you've seen people having the conversations around training environments, ecological training, traditional or cognitive style training. And I actually brought on a professor to talk about it. So, is it ecological? Is it cognitive style? Or is it both? Don's going to bring a educated look, I would say, an educated look at these two models. And guys, we're always going to talk about being pragmatic. Is it one or the other, or is it both? All right, guys, this is With All Due Respect, and you'll see that we are missing Gray, and there's a reason for missing Gray. Gray is getting married, and we decided that we're going to do some content without Gray here. With her not married, there's going to be a time she's going to have to do it when I can't do it. So I told her I'll do it around something that she thinks is kind of boring, and maybe that's jiu-jitsu, right? Which I always talk to her about doing. So if you showed up here looking for Gray, you got two old dudes, two old guys that showed up, and we're grayless. So today is Don. I think you guys have seen Don on here. We had Don part 1, Don part 2, talking about a story. But how this is going to relate to jiu-jitsu, a lot of people have heard about the ecological style of coaching. And it's been all over the jiu-jitsu community, and people are standing on one side of the bridge, and other people are standing on the other side of the bridge. And I think what we're going to talk about today is that probably being on the bridge somewhere on both is probably the best way to think about coaching. I didn't know this, but some of the best conversations me and Don have are off camera that aren't recorded. And we started talking about, hey, Don, what do you know about this cognitive style or this ecological style? He's like, well, I actually teach these classes. So what's cool about this is Don doesn't do jiu-jitsu. There's no jiu-jitsu bias going into this. Don can talk about this just from an academic side, also the practical side, because you've coached. So if we jumped into it, Don, tell a little bit about people. Well, why would I even want to talk to Don about ecological and cognitive psychology, which, Don, I didn't even know it came from that psychology, to be honest with you.
Sure.
I didn't know it was. Talk about the two classes you teach.
Yeah.
And what you teach them on and how they incorporate the ecological and the cognitive, what they even are,
Sure.
why this even matters. And let's tie the listener into, like, Don's an expert, right?
Thank you. Thank you.
Don is an expert at this. He's not an expert at jiu-jitsu, though some way he could be. Someday he could be. He could, you never know. But let's talk about this, set the stage. Talk about you teaching these classes and why it even matters. Why are we even teaching these?
Well, Josh, I want to just thank you for giving me this platform again, and inviting me back for a part 3. I do miss Gray being here, so I hope that everything goes well with her. And you mentioned being grayless, but I just want to point out that both of us have a lot of gray in our beards and on our heads. So we're not fully grayless, but we are missing the person of Gray. So why should the audience care? I guess the first thing I want to say is I'm just excited that this is at the forefront, that our industry is leaning into this space and is talking about it. And of course, friction, disagreement breeds a lot of attention, and folks are having these conversations about ecological approaches versus others. And I think it's great.
Yeah.
So you're not going to find from me that I'm going to tell you that I'm going to pick one side or the other, but I would like to give some names and some traditions. So let me start with, what I do here at Carson Newman is I teach a traditional. This is called the traditional approach to motor learning. This is one of the classical texts. McGill and Anderson, or Risberg and Schmidt are some of the classical textbooks. This traditional approach, the parent discipline, is cognitive psychology. And that means that there's been decades and decades of research looking at the individual, particularly what's going on in our minds, and things like knowing what the limits are of short-term working memory for the human. For example, about 20 to 30 seconds is what we have to be able to focus on one topic before we have to do something with that material. Either we got to start, storing it in long-term memory or repeating it. One of the other things I love to do when I speak on working memory is the idea of how many items can you remember from one time, like one kind of display of data points. And so I will do this word test. And I did it just a few weeks ago at a sports medicine talk, where I will read monosyllabic words. And then when I'm finished, I'll read about 20 or 30. Then I ask the audience to write them down. It's okay, how many words did you retain? And I kid you not, this research was done in the late 50s. But every time I've done this, and I've done this with hundreds of people now, it's always 7 items plus or minus 2. So it's a species specific limitation, which I think is so interesting. We know this from science. Whereas what I think is really also fascinating is that long-term memory, we have yet to reach the limits of that. And I challenge you, Josh, and anybody who's listening, have you ever not been able to store the lyrics of your favorite artist? No, of course not. Every time a new album comes out, a new song comes out, you love the music, you love the artist, man, you file that in. We know some things about the individual. But if we contrast that to another course that I teach, is called motor development, and this is the book about the 80s. A guy named Carl Newell out of University of Georgia, he started to really promulgate this concept of the ecological approach to skill acquisition, and it was specific. We're still using kind of the same model of the task, the individual, and the environment. But the emphasis was more on the environment, because he was talking about how do motor skills emerge in, let's say, babies and children. When we're talking about reflexes, we're talking about basic skills like ambulation, as well as, so as it develops, motor development, as well as how as it declines in the geriatric population. So I tell my students in my motor development course, I say, this class is really about the bookends of life. And it's very conceptual. So it's really an exercise of empathy, because I asked them to think a lot about babies and children. And then I asked them to think a lot about their grandparents, which is pretty hard for 18 to 22-year-olds to think about, kind of empathize with populations that, they haven't really thought a whole lot about. Mostly out of a class of 25, I'll have a handful of people who want to work in pediatrics and geriatrics, but by and large, they want to work with athletes or people like them. And so I get to teach these classes simultaneously. And so that's why I do think that my perspective is unique, and I'm excited and honored to get it out there, because ultimately, to just preface the rest of this talk, I'm going to tell Josh, you and the audience, that this is about equipoise. This isn't about one versus the other, or one is greater than the other. I think it's a both and equation.
Yeah, a few things popped into my head when you said things, and one, I'm at a jiu-jitsu seminar. There is a time that we have instructors that come into seminars and they're like, we want to do 3 hours. I'm like, not going to happen. You're going to lose everybody. Maybe an hour and a half. So many people tap out after the first 2 or 3 moves. So many tap out after they pick 2 or 3 things up. They're like, I tell people from a jiu-jitsu seminar that's mostly instruction.
Yes.
I pick up 1 or 2 things and I say, well, that's worth it for me. I pick up 1 or 2 moves and I drill them. That's worth it for me. I'll store that. And the rest is kind of lost, because there's so much talking.
Yeah.
There's so much cueing. There's so much instruction. So that comes to my mind when you say that. Why is this important, right? I think it's important because motor learning and motor development is learning how to do tasks is important. Not just so our the jujitsu kid can be good or the baseball player can be good, but motor learning and motor development is a very big topic in our industry. Learning skills, skill acquisition. It turned into that cool that cool word, right? Didn't it? It turned into skill acquisition.
Sure.
After talking to you, I kind of hate that word now. It's like, can we just go back to motor learning and motor
Yeah.
development instead
Yeah.
of skill acquisition? It's like somewhere along the line, somebody tried to. I feel like when people make up words like that, they're trying to legitimize what they're talking about by
Yeah,
calling.
Josh, I think what it is it's an economic influence or like a kind of a financial, term.
We're
You'll
going to
also
talk
hear
about
this.
that now. We're going to talk about that for sure.
Okay. You'll
Yeah.
hear about you'll hear this in exercise physiology as well. Exercise physiology will get a kind of financial terminology into it.
So can you kind of explain, like, all right, if someone's listening to this and they go, man, I've heard everybody talk about the ecological approach. Maybe they haven't heard about, a lot of people haven't heard about the cognitive traditional side. They didn't know there's another side to this. They just
Mm,
think there's this cool thing. We've talked about this in jiu-jitsu. This is not a new concept. Many pro sports teams have used this. Soccer teams in Europe have used this. Baseball programs have used this in the 90s to early 2000s. It's just that it's a new audience,
yes.
right? And it's got some characters around it, some people around it that are very captivating people. So it's a new
Mhm.
audience. In layman's terms, if somebody goes, whoa, 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 cognitive, whoa, whoa, ecological, you're throwing out some terms. What is cognitive learning, I guess, and what is ecological learning? If we were explaining this to the random jujitsu coach who just loved jujitsu and wanted to do it, or the random sports coach, the dad that's like, ooh, what is this cool thing?
Yeah, I think one of the parallels I would touch on, and you can tell me this isn't layman enough, but is nature versus nurture. In philosophy, right? We talk about nature versus nurture, which I love that conversation. Ultimately, who is responsible for, or what is responsible for why I am the way that I am? Is it because of my genetics? Am I predetermined? Is it me, the individual? Is it my nature? Or was it my environment? Was it the nurture piece, my parents or my culture or my ethnicity? And so I think that's fundamentally what we're talking about. And I think we all know, as you think deeply about this, it's not either or. It's both and. I think, right, you're given the gifts you have, the physical capacity, the abilities, and yes, we can train those things and we can develop them, but there's also environmental contexts and opportunities that are afforded to us. That's a term that the ecological folks really like, affordances. And if I could just rewind back, why is this conversation important? Why is skill acquisition important? Because I think this is tied heavily to self-efficacy. We gain confidence as individuals by learning things. One of the fundamental, I think, most important aspects of being human is our adaptability. And adaptability is another really synonym for learning, our ability to adapt or learn to a new environment. And when I look back on my career, for those of you who suffered through part one and part two, when I think about like going into Olympic style weightlifting in high school, I didn't have the quads for it. My front squat's not good. But what I really enjoyed was learning the skills, learning the clean and the jerk and the snatch and the push press. And then I got into powerlifting in college and I loved learning about the squat, the bench, and the deadlift and strongman and all of those things. For me, it was the excitement was in that front end of like, ooh, look at all this I get to learn. How do I pick up Atlas stones? How do I do this? How do I do that? And then self-efficacy, which is a very specific, special kind of version of confidence, is really defined as your competency in a particular environment with a particular task. Like it's not just general confidence. It's saying, when I'm in this setting doing this thing, I have confidence. But you take me out of this setting and out of that particular task. If you put me on a jujitsu mat, I'm not going to have any confidence. I don't know what I'm doing. But that novice, to kind of tie back to cognitive versus ecological, is if I were your student, Josh, as a complete novice, you're going to have to explain to me some of the fundamentals or foundation of what is jujitsu. I don't know what the rules are. I don't know the mat. I don't know any of the terminology. I mean, armbar, a couple of things I've seen,
Yeah.
but by and large, there's going to have to be some constructs that you're going to have to explain and put into my mind, whether it's the rules of the game or it's the kind of the space, like how far outside of the circle, if there's even a circle that I can be. When you use terminology, you're going to have to explain those things to me, and those are all individual constructs that I have to understand. If you're going to coach me and say, all right, in this moment, I want you to do this, that, and the other, put them in an arm bar. Well, if I don't know what an arm bar is, then I can't do that. So ecological folks will take it to an extreme and they'll say, there is no need for memory. We're just going to put you in an environment and we're going to create a situation where you will figure it out on your own, right? It's going to spontaneously represent or manifest this solution to the problem. Like, I'm laying on my back, you're laying on me, and then I'm trying to get free. And I think that for
That's
someone
an actual
who's
drill they do. That's an actual drill that you'll see in the environment. You were
Sure.
perfect with that. You're here, you're here. Your job is to stand up. Your job is to hold them down. Here are the
Sure.
rules. Go.
And my thing about that is that I love that creativity. There's nothing wrong with that approach. But you know, the challenge with that is I think you have to have some foundational knowledge about what the rules are. For example, if you're laying on me, Josh, and I'm a complete novice, and I start whacking you in the head with my elbow, can I do that in jiu-jitsu? My understanding is I can't. That's not part of, you know, the rules of the sport. If I start tickling you, I know that doesn't sound cool. Jiu-jitsu people don't tickle each other, but as a father, sometimes my sons are laying on me and I'm just tickling them off me, right? Like, but that's not an actual tactic that you guys would go after. If I just give you a wedgie, right? These are all things, right? These are all potential solutions to the problem, but those aren't accepted solutions to the sport that we're talking about. So it's not either or, it's both and. I think that the novice, that they really need some of this basic foundational nomenclature. Like, what is the language? What are the terminology? What are the rules? These are all mental constructs that the individual needs to process through their short term into their long term working memory. What's the outfit called? Right? It's called a gi. You guys use that, don't you? You use it to, like, you know, kind of hold on to people and do things, get them off balance. Like, there's some, you know, there's things that you model and you teach, and I think that that's not just for novices. I think that's going to be throughout the whole journey, because ultimately good instructors and good coaches, they do what works for their client or for their audience. And I think there's explanations for why some of these ecological tactics work within the traditional framework of the individual. For example, attentional focus is very limited. Like I said earlier, about 20 to 30 seconds, 7 items plus or minus 2. So if we give minimal instructions and very simple instructions, like when the person is on top of you, you need to get out of that. You need to find a way to get them off of you. That's very simple, very clear instructions. And that works for the cognitive limitations or the attentional demands that the individual is limited to.
So two things come to my mind. Okay. When I'm trying to differentiate, because I'm not an expert at this at all, right? I've coached for 25 years. I've always learned that I've always figured too that I always coach the individual, right? What works for one person might not work for one person. If you're a new coach, that's a hard thing for you to do, figure out, because like you'll have an athlete and say you're teaching a front squat. And I tell people one of the greatest coaching things I've ever seen in my life was my old business partner taught a 13-year-old girl how to front squat. It wasn't make a kid run a 4-4. I watched him for 20 minutes teach this girl how to front squat who was not an athlete. And I said, that's one of the greatest coaching things I've ever seen in my life. So you learn one way to coach somebody and you're 25 years old and you go, that
That
works.
is the way. That is the way.
I'm going to do this with everybody.
Sure.
Months later, somebody else comes in, you try to do that and they have no clue. So now you got to change it because you got to coach.
Sure.
So when I think of like in jiu-jitsu, it becomes the environment versus drilling. They say never do drilling. You don't need to do any drilling at all. It's all the environment. Let us figure it out. Of course, the words only are in there and never, right? That makes your brain. So I think about in other sports. Okay, playing catch or hitting off a tee in baseball. I think of running routes with nobody else around you, just learning how to run a route with and this is coming off the top of my head, so tell me if I'm wrong. A wide receiver, how to run a route. This is a route. Boom. There's nobody around. There's no snap. He's not going on a go. He's not hearing the play. He's not responding to the defensive back or the linebackers. He's just learning how to run a route, learning how to hit off a tee. If you met baseball players, they hit off a tee all the time. Tee work, tee work. It's a skill. Learning to kick a soccer ball. I had somebody that knows soccer really well. Watch my kid play soccer. I'm just passing, he's kicking. He comes up and he goes, no. Receive the ball like this, pass like that. Well, we were doing creative things for my kid to kick the ball, but as soon as this guy taught him how to creatively move the body, touch the ball, kick it into the corner, it changed immediately. He did it better, even in the environment we were creating. Jiu-Jitsu, this is an armbar, a 6-step armbar. Here are 6 steps. So those thoughts come into my mind when I think about ecological and cognitive, traditional, learning to run a route versus running a route with your environment. Bunting, learning how to bunt versus there's a guy on second and third, there's one out, the third baseman is crashing in, and you got to bunt here, right? Jiu-Jitsu says one thing all the time, and then I'll let you kind of expand on my blabbing. Everything you need to learn in jiu-jitsu, you learn up to purple belt. Like, you don't need to learn any more moves. You don't need to learn any more fundamental submissions or fundamental movements. At purple belt, all you need is the time and the environment and the mat time. And an example of this would be like, if you teach a white belt, you could have a black belt and a white belt learn a brand new move, a move the black belts never learned. Obviously, the white belts never learned it. You put them in a position to learn that, because the black belt has 10 years, the fundamental movements are instilled in their pattern. The movements we've done 1,000 times, we're just doing them in a sequence now we've never learned. The white belt's never learned any of those fundamental moves. While we are both new at the skill of that, we have the fundamental movements already in place. We're going to pick it up the second time we try it. White belt's going to spend all week and quit and not get frustrated and maybe learn it the second or third time they come back to it in a year, right?
Sure.
When I just explained that running a route versus running a route with people around you, bunting and the skill of bunting versus bunting in that environment, is that a good way to explain cognitive versus the ecological side? Do those analogies work, or am I way off?
I think they do. And I think that sometimes that maybe some other ways I will talk about it is the practice all-star. If we drill, the skill without the defender or without all the other variables, then they get really good at practice, right? The practice all-star. And then you put them in the game with the referees or with the defense, or the defense makes an adjustment, and then our offense suddenly doesn't work. So really, some concepts that I think are principles across both eco and cognitive, is something like the principle of specificity, right? We talk about early sports specialization in my classes, right? On one hand, right, specificity is like one of the most important concepts, principle of specificity, because we have to practice things in order to get good at them. But then the coach or the teacher needs to introduce a little bit of variability, because as the person gets better and better, right, they start to get some rote memorization. They understand what they're doing really well. Then they start to lose engagement. They get bored. So we have to introduce some variability. So introduce a variable. So maybe instead of hitting the ball off the tee, now we're hitting the ball off of a pitching machine, okay, to eventually, right, progressing to hitting live pitch. So this idea of specificity and variability, right, these things, they interplay with one another. And it's the coach or the instructor's job to introduce appropriate amounts of this. If we do too much variability, right, then it's too hard, there's too much failure, and we lose interest. If it's too much specificity, it becomes mundane and boring. There's this sweet spot. It's called the challenge point, is one of the models in the literature, or one of my mentors, Gray Cook, would call it the edge of ability, where we're constantly trying to tinker with, okay, where do we keep this person or this group of people? And of course, it gets much harder as we have a large group of individuals or a big team. You always have this bell curve of kind of their skills of creating practice or creating activities where we're keeping this person at that kind of challenge point where they're in that flow state of I'm engaged, I'm challenged, but it's not too little or too much.
Flow state. I think that's a whole different podcast. Could be, right? That flow state.
I'm
I'm high.
sure.
I'm high.
That's Daniel Kahneman's work for those who want to look into that more.
What's it? What's the name again?
Daniel Kahneman.
Okay.
He's a Nobel Prize winning economist. He's passed away now, but in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, what he started to pivot from, what this is so interesting to me. He was an economist, a kind of a scientist who studied large economic decisions. And what he found was, up until his work, economists thought that human beings made large purchases out of logic, out of rationality. But what he found was that's not true. We purchased houses and cars and made big financial decisions because of how it made us feel. And it completely revolutionized it. So a couple of books he wrote, which the audience I would highly recommend, is Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And another one was called Noise. But these are very much out of cognitive psychology.
Okay, so those are cognitive psychology concepts.
Yes, very much. Because you're studying the individual. When we say cognitive psychology, what we're saying is the person. Whereas when we say ecological, going back to your question about make this simple, ecological means we're looking at the environment. And you and I both have worked in private practice, right? Anybody who's been an entrepreneur knows that both of these matter. The customer experience matters as well as the environment that you create. Let me give you an example. On Monday, I shadowed a big time sports medicine orthopedist in Knoxville. And the first time shadowing this guy, he's a legend in our community. He's practiced here for 35 years. He's got 4 exam rooms in his hallway, in his non-operative space. And I spent the morning with him. And one of the things I noticed was how many pictures, right? He had created an environment in the hallway, in every exam room, anywhere there was a spot on the wall, there was a picture of a big time athlete and their signature. He is sending a message, right? Not only are you speaking to a really good surgeon who's really well trained, the individual is qualified or proficient, I would argue, but he's created an environment that is clean, it's orderly, and then he's telling you, hey, look, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've worked with a lot of elite athletes. All of us do this, right? We set the tone, we set the environment, whether there's music or the cleanliness, what the bathrooms look like. These things matter to the individual. And so everyone knows that both matter. I think it's just that the extremist, the dogmatist, gets a lot of attention online.
Well, I think that brings us to the next idea. Okay, I think we've tried to describe both. Bridging the gap. I've had a lot of conversations with people that teach and coach as the ecological side and the cognitive side have come out. And you'll get some people that say, oh no, it's only ecological. I've never had somebody say it's only cognitive, because drilling's boring. Drilling doesn't really sell. Bridging the gap between I've been able to have conversations with, if they're intellectually honest. You have to be intellectually honest to have this conversation. I've seen enough podcasts with people who are professionals in jiu-jitsu that I've come to the point that I don't want to listen to them anymore, because they're not being intellectually honest. They're saying things and agreeing to things that I know that down deep they don't believe are true. They put themselves in a corner to have to fight and argue for this.
Yeah.
And they begin fighting and arguing. I said it before we went live. I want to be around people that want to get it right, not people that want to be right. That means you have to be able to sit down and say, hey, I need to adjust my previous way of thinking, because it's not about me being right. It's about the team of people that I'm around getting it right for the student and the athlete. They are the most important person. I give this example. LA Lakers were famous for having the run and gun 1980s and 90s team that ran up and down those Showtime and scoring 150 points a game, or not really, but like over 100 points a game, which at that time was unheard of. They're running up and down, they're playing awesome. And all these people became experts at that style. What they don't realize is that style became experts because they had the team to do it. The Lakers didn't have that. They had to have a different team. I do think that those coaches could coach both ways. They just realized that I have the team set up to do this.
Sure. Right. This is the talent we have.
Talent we have, this is what we're going to do. Pat Riley probably never argued to have a more of a slow down game because he knew he didn't have it.
Yeah.
Do you think Pat Riley could probably coach the slow down game and possession game? Probably. Right. Probably could do it.
Sure.
But he wanted to win games. We're coming to what we want to win games. You bridging the gap, it's not either or, it's both. You say that. Both approaches based on context, athlete experience, and the nature of the skill. Blend approaches. We must blend the approach.
Sure.
Some person. I saw this and I wanted to say it and bring it up. Cognitive instruction is best when done early, transitioning into more exploratory variable practice. Would it be fair to say that the cognitive approach, the traditional approach, is better for the earlier person, but as they become more experienced, we blend in more of the ecological approach? So if you're a coach in your jiu-jitsu and you walk in and you're in a room full of purple belts, you're probably doing less cognitive style. If you walk in there and you're doing a self-defense class to a bunch of moms who've never done it, you're probably doing more of you're probably not doing ecological, you're probably doing more traditional style.
Yep.
Would that be accurate to say that the newer
Yeah.
person is more cognitive?
Yeah. Yes, I think so. And I think that's based on the evidence, because we know that as novices, right, we know their limits, their cognitive limitations. They can only focus, right, on one thought, one concept, for a brief period of time. They're only going to retain, right, the things you say at the beginning and the things you say at the end. This is called primacy and recency effect. So back to that word recall, a game or challenge that I give my students. What is so interesting is when I read off these 25 or so monosyllabic words, after I'm done and they go to write what they retained, right, in their short-term memory, it's almost always a couple of words at the beginning and a couple of words at the end. All the words in the middle, they don't remember.
That's pretty consistent.
Yes, very consistent.
That's interesting.
And yeah, and I've never gotten someone to get, again, 7 plus or minus 2. Of course, sometimes you have a couple folks who will get a little bit below. I think I may have had one time where someone got more than 9, but it's super, super rare. And so we know that there are some limitations. And this reminds me, of kind of the expertise journey, because we're all on this journey. Fitz and Posner called it cognitive, associative, and autonomous, right? The stages of motor learning. Anybody who's taken a PE class, a motor learning class, has heard that. Gentile, her model, I really like this. And Gentile is just a continuum. And you start as a novice, and then you're on a journey towards expertise. And and the way I teach it to my students is that this line never ends. There's never, this like dot at the end where, oh, I've made it, I'm now an expert. We're always kind of improving and moving. We're all talking about expertise, right? Which, when we think about practice and drilling or creating environments to learn, then it's really about this transference. How well does this transfer to the test? So when we think about, is it either or, both and, like how they fit, I think your example works very well. And I think the way that you hold yourself accountable as a coach or a teacher is you have to have your own system. How are you testing the efficacy of your approach? So most of us, it's competition. Ultimately, right, we're preparing this person to compete in something. We're going to scrimmage, or we're going to spar, and we're going to see if they're doing better now than they did last time. And maybe the first time they spar, they get submitted in 30 seconds, and then the next time it's 45 or it's 60. Whatever that metric is. Each coach and teacher that's listening, I just encourage you to think about your feedback loop and how can you make that as objective as possible. A quote I'd like to provide: one of my favorite philosophers, Bruce Lee. I love this. He says, and I just want to kind of recite this the best I can, is he says, when I was first introduced to the martial arts, a punch was a punch and a kick was a kick. I started to study the martial arts, and a punch was no longer a punch and a kick was no longer a kick, meaning it got complicated. Once I mastered the martial arts, a punch was a punch and a kick was a kick. It's not quite as popular as the quote that a lot of folks throw around of, I'm not afraid of the person who knows 1,000 kicks, but the person who studied the one kick and has done it 1,000 times. The concept is that the journey of expertise for all of us is we go from simple to complex, right? We're trying to understand the pieces and the forces and the positions and so on, the nomenclature. And then once we get it to a pretty good amount, then we try to make it simple again. That is the journey, from novice to expert. And I really don't care what the activity is or the sport. I have seen that across my entire career, studying humans. Why I love this area and why I think this conversation is so important is because I think it's a universal human experience. How we learn things and how we become experts. I think that's, generally speaking, that is the journey. Now, you can put different tasks or skills into that, but by and large, you first kind of see your parents driving and you're like, how hard can that be? You turn signals, put it in drive, whatever. First time you get behind the wheel, is it that simple? All of a sudden, it's like, oh, wait a minute. There's a lot of risk and danger.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of buttons and there's screens and there's lights and what's a yield versus a stop sign. And there's a lot of decision making. And then after you gradually kind of get exposed to how to drive and putting yourself in different environments, like rural driving versus downtown driving, eventually you get used to it, right? You get used to the environments that you're in. So we use driving a lot in that cognitive, like the motor learning and performance course that I teach. That's really the model, because almost everyone in my class has learned to drive.
There's a focal point there talking about driving. Everybody can be like, got it. I get it.
Right.
There's something very poetic about his quote about a punch is a punch. Then when he got done, a punch is still a punch when he went through and I can relate to that now, being 48. I could not relate to that at 23.
Sure.
Bruce Lee also said something, and I'm paraphrasing. He talked about how he studied all of these martial arts and he brought in what was good, what actually worked in a real fight. He absorbed it, but then he kind of dispelled the things that didn't.
Yes.
So when we think about this style of learning, cognitive, ecological, traditional, whatever, you have to pull out all of the good things about it and apply both to your coaching, and take the things that don't apply and just say they don't apply.
Yeah.
And we can't do that for some reason in our society anymore. We have to be all in. We have to be, is the word dogmatic?
Yeah, I think so.
Would the word also be polarized?
Yes.
Tribalism?
Sure.
Identify fully with something, right? I heard somebody
Can I say why we do this? I think why we do this is because we acquire or absorb confidence and certitude. We find certainty in that. And you and I both have been familiar with lots of tribes in our industry where there's a guru, there's a leader. And then what I think is super interesting is that, their top echelon, their disciples, they start to actually dress and look like the leader.
Oh my gosh. That is so, almost makes me have a vomit feeling.
Well, and I just want to say for the audience that I also have fallen prey to that early in my career. I absolutely did some of that, and I modeled myself after some of those people, and it was good. I think some of this is Dunning-Kruger, and it's okay to do that. But I want to encourage the listener to dig deeper and to continue to pursue truth, and be, like you said, intellectually honest. Because that quote of Bruce Lee, I'm just trying to give it to the audience. It's adapt what is useful, reject what is useless, and add what is specifically your own. And I loved that Bruce Lee quote. And I have tried to embody that, and I've tried to share that to my students.
When people become tribalist, ideological is the word I was looking at. They say, okay, I'm now attaching my name to this group. And then they adapt everything from that group. They become the avatar of that group without thinking through everything that group believes.
Yep.
We start appealing names to it. And you get people that will say, I'm an ecological guy. Well, I bet I can find some things you don't agree with in ecological. So you're not really an ecological guy, right?
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
um, I've had conversations with coaches that come and sit down with me, and they're 23 to 25,
Sure.
and they say things to me, and I don't argue with them. I just hear what they're at because I know where they're at in their coaching.
Sure.
This is what we're missing. This is what we're doing. This is where we really need to go with this industry. This is where we need to go with coaching. Yeah, man, I hear
Sure.
you. I feel you.
Sure.
I get you.
Yeah.
And I know where they're going through. And then 10 years later, I'll follow up because I've had this happen. They're like, yeah, man, like, I think it might be a little bit different than what I thought. Yeah, it probably is.
Yeah.
Probably is. And I'm just understanding their process that they're going to go through.
Sure. Yes. I think
I think they
to
have
me,
good.
yeah, to me, there's a difference in being persuaded by the guru or the sage on the stage with their presence and their charisma. That I think is pretty easy. We are persuaded pretty easily by charisma, all of us as a species, right? We want to follow the leader who seems like super confident that this is the way that it's supposed to happen. It's very different though when you're trying to write down what you think works, and it's harder to be charismatic through the word, right? As well as through the science. So at some point, this conversation gets into epistemology about where do you find your information and what is the barrier of entry to provide information in that mode? Meaning, to create a podcast or to have a social media influence, the barrier of entry is very low. To publish in a high ranking peer reviewed journal is a very different thing. And so I actually, in preparation for this conversation, I went and talked to Jared Porter at UT on Monday, a couple days ago. And I asked him, because he's a great researcher, he's highly published, he's an excellent methodologist. And I said, can you help me understand? I don't understand, how do you study the ecological approach in a lab? Like, how do you control for that?
Didn't I ask you some of that? Didn't
You
I say,
did?
how do we prove
Yeah.
this? How do we prove
Yeah. And he kind of, he smiled and smirked a bit and kind of looked off and said, great question. I don't know. And so I'm not saying that there isn't any evidence for the ecological approach, because there's lots of experts who say small-sided games, constraints, and all of those things do work. I'm not arguing that, but I think the explanatory model for why those things work could be explained conceptually from the ecological framework, but it also can be explained and supported by the cognitive framing as well. And so when you think about this and you're like, okay, if I were to design a study where I was going to study the individual, right, as the variable of what are their limits of focus of attention or, cognitive limitations, it's easier, although not great. I mean, Job Franson just published a scoping review, which I think is phenomenal, really kind of critiquing, well, what do we really know about skill acquisition from the literature? And I think it's great because we have a tendency to conflate correlation and causation. Like if we study golf and then we say, well, this is what happens in individual sports like golf or throwing darts, and then we try to transpose that onto football or basketball. Like, I don't know that we can do that. So there's certainly limits, right? But it's easier to study the individual, is what I'm trying to get at, than it is to study the environment and to manipulate one kind of aspect of the environment. There's plenty of conceptual papers and lots of people who are advocating for this. And I think it's wonderful. And I'm all for the conversation. I just wanted to point out that the level of knowing is different.
No, I like that. We can't prove, because I tend to put people into corners sometimes. I say, can we prove that? No, but we can use the research that leaves some clues that makes us think this could be the outcome of it.
Sure.
I can't 100% prove. It's hard to prove anything, don't you think? Like,
Sure. Yes.
the concept
I agree.
doesn't work well. There are people in the ecological side of this in jiu-jitsu that say, prove it. And then they look at the guy that's kind of pumping ecological training. They were having these coaches form a team for this competition. He couldn't provide anybody for the team, and he's never provided world champions. And then the people he criticizes, they've provided world champions. And I kind of defend the guy a little bit because I'm like, whoa, that doesn't prove it. They're trying to I almost feel like maybe they're trying to embarrass the ecological guy, be like, well, you can't even come up with a team for this, and this other guy that you criticize, he's got world champions, he's got a team for that. Yeah, but that doesn't mean anything. There's a lot of variables to that. You got to
Sure.
be intellectually
Sure.
honest, and you know, it's okay to defend the people that maybe you don't 100% disagree with when they're right about something. That
Sure.
that's okay, right? We don't have to just bash and bash and bash and bash and bash.
Right.
Um, yeah, we can't prove this works. So I did ask you that. Well, what's the research say? And you came back with like some things to look at and some things to read. Well, you can't really prove that, but we can get some clues from it.
Yeah,
The
because I'm here for the creativity. I think the ecological crowd has come up with some really great, terminology, concepts, right? Affordances, constraints, which are neither positive nor negative, small-sided games. I mean, I love when humans are moving, I'm interested. I don't really care if it's martial, if it's rehabilitative or restorative or performance or sport. I'm interested. I I think that's what I'm trying to say is that we know that these things work, right? The eco folks they're so passionate about it because they're saying, hey, this really works. When I create a small game, right, that gets people to creatively problem solve the situation, it works. And I am not disagreeing with that at all. I think that's absolutely correct. Why it works, we're still trying to research that and understand that on a deeper level. But I think part of why it works is both the individual and where the individual is in their journey of expertise, as well as the environmental constraints and situation that you created. So again, it's not either or, it's both and. There needs to be equipoise in the way that we understand and we talk about these things.
Yeah, we were one of my conversations I had with somebody is they brought up a very traditional gym that produces a lot of champions um in California. And my a friend of mine who's all in on ecological, like has gone to the seminars, is all in, will go so far as saying that like we're 100% ecological. And I'm just like, 100%, I don't know. Right, it doesn't work. You're probably not. If I went and watched it, you're probably not 100%, right? And I said, well, maybe those gyms in California that produce these world champions, they might not use the word ecological. They might not even know what it means. They have experienced coaches that have learned that small-sided games like that are beneficial. They might have never done the research, but if an ecological person walked in there and go, oh yeah, they're doing ecological training. Look what they did at the last half of that training. That's all ecological. And the coaches will go, no, we're just trying to make people better. We just figure out this works. So they're probably doing a little bit of both. They just don't have the term and the education behind it. They're just these coaches that have created world champions and realized from trial and error that this is what's worked, right?
Yes.
It reminds me of and this is going to be a stretch. I remember reading a story about a kid in India that got a hold of a basic math textbook. You might have heard the story. And a missionary left a basic math textbook. And this kid in India ended up developing from this math textbook amazing formulas around, like, I believe it was calculus and trigonometry and all of these theories from just a basic mathematic textbook. This kid wasn't highly educated. He just read the book and extrapolated all of these things from it, right? That seems extremely ecological to me. He never had basic instruction. He never had math class. He never had step-by-step stuff. He
Sure.
was given a small framework, and from that framework, he developed very high concept things.
Yeah. Sure.
And that part of the brain amazes me. When we talk more, I want to talk about, you used a word earlier, you know, the con man idea of they got big personalities.
Sure.
Well, I learned recently that the word con man comes from the word confidence man.
Mm.
That con men are very confident and they're very influential, they're very captivating. We've all seen those people. It's cult mentality. Jiu-jitsu is full of cult mentality.
Mhm.
Brutal cult mentality. My coach is the only way. My coach won't let me train at other gyms. I can't train at other gyms or else I'm kicked out. Um, It's a cult mentality. Some of that's based in fear. A lot of it's based in capitalism. They just don't want your dollar going somewhere else.
Sure.
It's selfish. And there's a cult mentality in jiu-jitsu where it's our school versus your school, our thought versus. I've never been that way. I don't care if you go train other places. It's never been my deal. But the people that are pushing this eco-only thing, they're very captivating people. They're very confident. But what I'm starting to see, and this is a human nature conversation, they start to become very defensive.
Yeah.
I've been in conversations with people where they get defensive, and I go, whoa, I'm not arguing you. I'm trying to understand for me. You say
Sure.
you know a lot about this, so I'm asking you to educate me.
Sure.
I'm not giving you a counter to your point to disagree with you. I'm giving you a counter to understand your response so I can have a better perspective, not offend you, right? We're in the fitness industry. There is a lot of that in our fitness industry.
Yeah.
One of the jokes I kind of say is, man, I remember when people started putting monoliths on their platforms.
Yeah.
So they had platforms, they're Olympic lifting, and all of a sudden they're all West Side guys and they're putting monoliths on the platforms and becoming, I'm all in on this guy after a seminar. I go to seminar, I'm all in on that.
Sure.
Whoa, 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 calm, slow your roll, bro. Like,
Sure.
um, this is the subject that actually interests me the most when I talk about the ecological and then the versus, right? It's a versus. It's against the traditional.
Right.
What's not sexy is our conversation right now is not sexy. That's the
That's
problem,
right.
Tom.
That's right.
You know what they going somebody's gonna watch this podcast and want to go, I want to hear this dude go in and bash ecological and bash these people and bash cognitive style. Some people are like, oh, I'm gonna listen to this dude go all ecological in because that's what's cool right now. And the traditional side of this is he's gonna bash it all. No, no, he's not. It's not sexy to be in the middle anymore.
Sure.
Right? People
Agreed.
aren't gonna watch it anymore. Part of the reason I wanted to do this, Don, is I wanted to bring a little bit of common sense to the subject.
Sure.
You know, what is it about us as people that we want to move everything to the edges and not bring it into the middle that says both, not and or?
Yeah. Yeah.
This subject has what this subject has brought more light to me is, wow, we are flawed logistically in our society across the board.
Yeah.
You have to have some thoughts on that because I know you have some thoughts on
Sure. Yeah. I think it's about being able to disagree and not dislike one another. As soon as you disagree with someone, then, one of the most common steps next is ad hominem attacks. Like, okay, well, you must be like this, that, or the other because you have this political persuasion or religious conviction or this opinion about this or that. What I can tell you as a mid-career professional, as a middle-aged person, what I am really drawn to now are people who speak or present or teach, and I hear them use two phrases: I don't know, and I'm sorry. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for people who say, I used to think this. And I want to, kind of full disclosure, I want to tell the audience that about a decade ago, I spoke at an NSCA event in Roanoke, Virginia. And the title of my talk was Authentic Motor Control. And at some point in the presentation, I did promote dynamical systems theory. No, when I look back on that and I think to myself, wow, I didn't really know what that meant. It was just hot at the time. And so I kind of toss it in there as like the environment, and the environment's important. But I didn't give it equipoise. I just kind of said, yeah, like look this up. So I too have done this, and I have fallen prey to this and the Dunning-Kruger effect, because we are, we're trying to be confident, right? We're trying to know some things and to help people. And I think that's noble. And I want to do that. I think sometimes, maybe the audience might listen to me, or, I show some textbooks and might say, a lot of us have sat in college courses and heard theory and been like, oh, I hate the theory. And I try to tell my students, because I do talk about theory quite a bit. These are upper level courses, 400 level courses. And I say, look, like theory is really important. And they'll say, really? Like, why? Like, prove it. And I've thought a lot about this. And so I'm gonna make this Immanuel Kant quote. All right. Practice without theory is blind. So we can learn a lot of things about practice or through experience. Like you said, some of these folks who've been coaching jiu-jitsu for 20 and 30 years, they have accrued a lot of knowledge about what works and what doesn't work. But without theoretical underpinnings or understandings, how do you teach the novice coach to get better quicker without the 20, 30 years of experience? The second part of the phrase for Immanuel Kant is that theory without practice is mere intellectual play. So it's not either or. It's not, oh, we only learn through practice and I don't care about theory or the science. Same, though, but a little different is we don't also just care about theory and not about practice, right? That would be the argument against the ivory tower. People who think about things and stay in the classroom or in the lab and they don't actually apply it. Again, practitioners tend to want to just hang out with practitioner groups, and then theoreticians or researchers, they just want to hang out with their tribe. They go to different conferences, they kind of sort of stay apart. The best in our field are the ones that can transcend, right, those arbitrary walls, that they're able to kind of, flux in and out of practitioner audiences, of researcher audiences, to bring data, to present their research in a way that is consumable and applicable. And so that's what I'm interested in, more than anything, is the humility to say, here's what I think we know, here's what we don't know. A lot of practice is informing research. It's informing our theoretical frameworks, because there's a lot of things that eco folks have discovered and created that work really, really, really well. And I want to celebrate that. And the conversation is really, really good and it's rich. Why does it work and how does it work? I think we're still trying to figure that out.
I can give you multiple examples in my career where I've had to evolve my stance on things,
Yeah.
and I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
Because I don't think I need to bury myself into a corner where cognitive dissonance turns me into an idiot.
Yeah.
And illogical and argumentative. Two things that come into my mind when we talk about, I took plenty of biomechanics classes growing up.
Sure.
Where we broke down strength and conditioning movements.
Sure.
None of them met anything until I got into our bar.
Sure.
Until I got in the bar, I went, oh,
yeah,
this is all theory until you put the bar on your back.
Sure.
Another example that kind of fits what we were talking about. We one time had at the facility I was at, we had a whole strength staff from a college come and visit, and one of the professors was going to do a study, a big presentation at a conference on velocity-based training in Olympic lifting.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point in time, my business partner had maybe been involved in strength and conditioning for 2 years, started Olympic lifting, was a electrician by trade. And we're sitting around there talking with all these smart PhD candidate people. And the guy started explaining his study, and he said, well, we're measuring average velocity of the full Olympic lift. And he goes, as opposed to peak velocity. And my business partner raised his hand and goes, I'm not sure how that works, because the intent of the movement is not full velocity at all time. And the guy goes, stopped. He's a very, very smart man that a lot of people know.
Yeah.
The other guy is a guy who was an electrician 2 years ago.
Sure.
And at that point, the head strength coach at the facility turned and looked at the guy after we all kind of talked about it for 10 minutes. I didn't talk about it. I listened. And the guy looks at him and goes, I think you probably need to adjust your presentation before you talk to more.
Yeah.
And we walked away. Everything was fine. We all walked away. Everything's cool. And I looked at my business partner, and I still say this to him today. I said, you're an electrician. That moment in my career made a huge impact on me, because, the fallacy of the rule of authority. And I know best because I'm a PhD. Went out the window. I completely, when my man goes, well, the intent of the movement isn't full velocity, so why don't you measure peak velocity instead of average? And the dude, when I tell you the room went,
Hmm.
I went, and even the guy doing, and I looked at my dude and I went, that was awesome.
Sure.
Because little old guy just raised his hand. He's like, I have a question.
Sure. Which is why we should be having more conversations across these, again, these fictitious walls. Research labs should be inviting practitioners from the community, which has, been somewhat my role at the Motor Learning Lab at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. When I can, I try to join their research lab, meetings and just be a part of the conversation, and they give me a lot of respect as a teacher and a practitioner, and they say, okay, this is my grad student, this is my proposal for my study, and they'll be like, what do you think about this? And I get a chance to just kind of be part of the conversation in research design. I just think we need more people, right, to explore these spaces that maybe that you're not comfortable in. Back to self-efficacy of like, yeah, I'm not a researcher, that's not what I do. I introduce my students to research and I try to give them an impression on why it's important. But I'm attracted to people. I don't care what the letters are behind their names or the titles, if they're an electrician or a PhD. It doesn't matter to me. I'm attracted to candor, transparency, honesty about this is what I think I know, but I am open to kind of your perspective. Some of the best practitioners I've ever shadowed or been around. If you go to shadow a practitioner somewhere in a weight room at an ACC or an SEC school, here's what I hope that they would do. I don't care if it's a strength coach, athletic trainer, doesn't matter, physician. Here's what I do and what I hope that more people will do. Someone comes to shadow me and I say, here's a notepad, here's a notebook, here's, instructions. I want you to write every single thing down that you have a question or that you see that I could be better. And then after we're done with patient care or we're done in the weight room, I want you to send it to me. Let's talk about it. Right? Like, let's, give me feedback. How can I be better? Use that opportunity to be improved. And I don't care if you've been in this field for, 20, 30, 40 years. Dave Williams was one of my most beloved mentors, who was someone who built the strength and conditioning program at my alma mater. And he was one of the most humble people, up until and through his retirement. And I love that. I love that about him, that it was never about how he had all the answers. It was always about, what do you have to contribute? He'd come to me and say, we've had a couple ACLs on women's basketball. What am I doing different? What am I doing wrong? How can I help and fix this? And that collaboration, because ultimately these problems are not simple. Humans are not simple. How we learn is not simple. What I can tell you is that we are good at learning. Human beings are adaptable. We learn in lots of ways. There's lots of tactics and strategies that work. And so it would be very myopic for any of us, right, to stay in one specific, like monoplanar kind of approach. The conversation of skill acquisition really started with Nikolai Bernstein almost 100 years ago. He was talking about how blacksmiths swing hammers, about how during the motor learning process for blacksmiths, that the difference between a novice and an expert was that an expert always hit in the same place, but the swing, how they kind of manipulated their tool, was could be variability in how they do that, but they always ended in the same place. So for the audience who really wants to get into this, Nikolai Bernstein is a kind of a father figure, a legend in this space. He talks about freezing degrees of freedom, how when you're a novice, you really are kind of thinking about one plane of motion at a time. I also like to parallel that with pain. When we're in pain, we also freeze degrees of freedom, right? We only want to move in one plane. But eventually, the rehabilitation professional, our job is to help unfreeze, right, the other planes of motion so that my person isn't stuck, in this posture, or stuck only moving in the sagittal and frontal, or only moving, with a lumbar locked position where they don't actually let their back move. There's just a lot more to learn here, and I think that what I hope that people get out of listening to us today is the humility. That humility and love go hand in hand. I talked about love in some of my other parts. I love our industry. I love our profession. I love working with my people, and that humility is an other centered love, right? Where we are saying, you know what, I don't have all the answers. I'm going to approach this conversation with humility. I'm going to accept when I was wrong. I'm going to admit that. I'm going to, be better tomorrow, be better next time. I want to look back on my career last year or 10 years ago and go, man, I really wish I had a chance to treat those people again, to
Yeah.
coach those people again, because who I was then and what I was thinking then is, I think I'm better now than I was then. And that's a continuous journey for all of us. And I think we're all on the same path of trying to help our people learn things and be better and execute their skills and have success. And that there's lots of ways to do that.
I sometimes feel like I should apologize to people I trained when I was 25.
Sure.
You said something about the blacksmith. The end of the swing all ended up in the same spot.
Yes.
They all had a different swing.
Yeah.
There probably were some foundational principles around the swing they all had.
Yeah.
The middle area that the swing was different. They ended up in the same spot.
Yes.
Humility. Don, I'll finish up with this. One thing about me is I'm really hard on people that consider themselves experts. I'm really hard on leaders. I'm really hard on people of authority. I had a very strong father growing up, and I had high expectations of my father. So when I think of fathers and leaders and professionals and authorities, I think of my father, right, who's a very larger than life. I tell people that people go, "What was it like growing up in your home?" I said, "My dad's favorite coach was Bobby Knight." They go, "Oh,
Mm.
got it." Right? You're like, "Oh, well, that's all I need to say." So, I'm the guy that goes, I'll sit in church sometimes and I'll have a notepad and I take notes. And my wife will look at me and I'll go, and I'll write something down. She goes, "What's that?" She's like, I'm not sure if I agree with that. But they just said, and I wanted to look more into that. She's like, "Man, you're so hard on people. You're so hard. I'm so hard on like sometimes like orthopedics. I refuse to call them doctor, whatever. I call them by their first name, right? Because I'm just like, I'm not like, they want to be these perfect forms of authority and you're not.
Sure.
So I'm really hard on even leaders. I'm really hard on leaders. And I had somebody recently call me. We had a cramping issue at our school last year. A first game, we had like 6 or 7 kids cramp out, and I took it personal. And I had somebody call me that probably doesn't know a lot about cramping. They're a coach, they're athletic, they know a little bit, but they go, "Hey, I got some suggestions." And I went, "Let's hear it, bro. Like, if you find the answer to this, and it's the number one thing, and our kids don't cramp game one,
Sure.
I am all for it.
Sure.
Does not hurt my feelings." I one time was in a doctor's office with a kid, a wrestler was going to go play Division 1. He's going to be an awesome wrestler, and he had a torn meniscus. I'm sitting in there with an orthopedic. So this is, if you're an orthopedic and what I said earlier hurt your feelings, this should make you feel better.
Orthos don't have feelings.
Yeah, right. They shouldn't. Right. They right. And the orthopedic's sitting there, and we're talking, and he goes, "Man, do we stitch it or do we take it out?" He's like, "Man, like." I don't know. He turned and looked at me and goes, "What do you think?" And I'm like, "What do I think? We're relying on me for this? Like, what are you talking about?" I looked at the parent. I was like, "Hey, we're in trouble," when he asked me what I think about this. I go, but at the time, he's just looking for some like, what are the pros and cons of taking it out and put like, what's the kid got in 6 months? Is he going to have arthritis? Do we need to get him right back now and not care about when he's 40, or is he really not going to be that good and we should worry about when he's 40? Like, that's the conversation you want to have. But when he turned and looked at me, he goes, "What do you think?" I'm like, "I don't know." And I learned that from him. And now when I have interns and people that come to me and we're writing programs, I put stuff together and I look at these kids in college. I go, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this. What do you think?" They go, "What do I think?" I go, "No, I want to know what you think because you have an opinion and I'm not perfect. And if you can fix something in this that helps the kids get better and you don't say something to me, I'm going to be mad at you."
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
There's a guy that's helping our weight room right now. He's taken 2 hours in the morning to come help us. He's an attorney by trade.
Mm.
He squatted 1,000 pounds. He's
Wow.
squatting and benching. He's phenomenal at teaching those movements. He's a lawyer by trade. You know what he did the first day when we taught everybody how to squat? I walked away. And I said, I want to see how you teach it. I'm not
Yeah.
analyzing it. You're an expert in this area. You did it for years. You don't do it anymore, but you did it for years.
Right.
And he's like, what, are you serious? I said, yes, I'm here I need you to do this. So
Sure.
maybe you come up with a way of cueing this that kids hear it different and then they do it. And there were 2 kids that picked something up in his wording that began to squat better. And these are kids I've coached for 3 years.
Sure.
Does not hurt my feelings because the ultimate goal is the holistic value the kid gets. The kid got better.
That's right.
Sole purpose. My opinion,
right.
how I felt about it. Don, I cannot tell you how much I don't care.
That's right. I agree. Yeah, the mature coach recognizes that it's not about them, that it's not about us, the individual practitioner. It's about the client, the athlete, the team. It's not about me. It's about who I'm working with and their goals and their progression. And so if that means they have to work with somebody else, or I introduce somebody else into the system and that helps them learn, then that's great.
Doesn't hurt my feelings. I'm happy for the kid
That's
that I
right.
was a part of figuring it out.
That's right.
The number one thing I want people to get from this is if you're a coach, I don't care if you're jiu-jitsu, a baseball coach, you have to bring humility to the table. I had to learn that because I was a lot smarter at 28 years old, Don. I really was.
Me too.
I was one of the greatest coaches in the area. I've had people introduce me before. They're like, hey, one of the best coaches in the area, Josh Ortegon. I'm like, whoa, don't put that on me. Because
Yeah.
now I'm going to have to stand up to that, and I'm going to have to bring some sort of prophecy to my discussion when you're going to realize it's really not that smart, right? It's just
Right.
simple. It's just done very well, right?
That's right.
Don, this is awesome. I appreciate it. I hope the jiu-jitsu nerds that I'm friends with like it. I hope the coach people I'm friends with like it. I hope human beings pay attention to this and they say, you know what? I probably need to be less tribalistic in my views. Maybe I need to look at other views and have different perspectives. One of my favorite hashtags right now is perspective over perception. So I thank you very much for coming on, and I'm sure we'll do more.
Josh, thank you for your leadership and your invitation to do this.
Yes, sir. And Gray, we love you.